Happy Wednesday. Here we are in the middle of the week again already. It's the first full week of the year 2014. Hope you had a good day today. This is an anniversary year, not an anniversary of a fun time in the history of humankind. World War I was a global war. Not quite as global, of course, as World War II, but it was a global war nonetheless. Centered in Europe, that began on 28 July 1914 and lasted until 11 November 1918, a little over 4 years. From the time of its occurrence until the approach of World War II in 1939, it was simply called the Great War by most people. In America, it was initially called the European War. In those little over 4 years, more than 9 million human beings were killed. A casualty rate exacerbated by the belligerents' technological and industrial sophistication and a tactical stalemate. It was the fifth deadliest conflict in world history, as far as we know, paving the way for major political changes, including revolutions in many of the nations involved, and ultimately, of course, paving the way for World War II. With us tonight is our colleague of so many years now, one of the great historians on the planet, probably the best historian I've ever known, Webster Griffin Tarpley, who has some things to say about the anniversary of World War I. Welcome back, Webster, and best wishes for the new year to you.
Right. Happy New Year, Jeff. How are you?
Thank you. I'm here, sir. Thank you. Very good. Yeah. Okay.
Well, as you're certainly right. It's 2014, so that means it's 100 years since 1914, and that's the beginning of World War I. And the figures are simply immense, as you say.
Immense.
If you just do the casualty side of it, the Russian Empire had 9 million casualties: killed, wounded, missing, captured. That's 75% of all the forces that were mobilized by the Russian Empire. And
75%. Wow.
75%. They fared the worst in absolute terms. In proportional terms, though, in terms of what part of the population got killed, that was France. And you can see when you do that to one of the most advanced countries in the world, right, in terms of education, science, and so forth, the damage then is colossal, right, because it damages the progress of humanity, right. You could say some of the great scientists of the 1920s were simply killed on these.
Well, the flower of British manhood is said to have been killed. But beyond that, your point is extremely important. We lost many brilliant people who would have potentially dragged the society kicking and screaming to a better place. We lost them. Right. They're gone. Right. And this is before the age of antibiotics, folks. Remember, infections killed a lot of the wounded, lots of them.
Sure, and there were all sorts of other complications. But let's get to the heart of the matter. There's already a debate or a brawl going on, and let me just make a couple of points about this, because it's more evident in Europe than it is here. But I think it's likely to come here in some form or other. It is the anniversary year, right? If you look at Der Spiegel, right, this German, the dominant news magazine from Hamburg, right? Their cover was for the first week of the year, 1914, and typically enough, it comes down to a match between Germany and Great Britain about who's responsible. The British have gotten out in front with this historian, I guess you can call him Max Hastings. You may have seen him. He's already been on book tour. He's been on C-SPAN. And naturally he wants to blame Germany and whitewash the British. And we've just had a political row in Great Britain. The Education Secretary, Michael Gove, G-O-V-E, came out and started blabbing about how the war guilt clause essentially was correct, right? That Germany was the country that was most responsible for this. And there was a column here in the Daily Telegraph London a couple of days ago with Boris Johnson. I think he's still the mayor of London, saying that he agrees with that. He agrees with Hastings. He agrees with Gov. It's German guilt. And then on the other side, though, you have the British Labour Party trying to say that this is demagogy coming from the Tories, the Conservatives. And here we have various people. Tristram Hunt, the shadow education secretary, the guy, in other words, the guy who would become the education minister if the Labour Party took over the government of Britain, which they might well do in the immediate future. He says no. This is simply trying to score points today, and you can see that there's a lot of animus against Germany these days. Some of that, unfortunately, is well deserved, but the question then is, well, where is historical truth? Now, what I want to recommend, and just bear with me when I do this, just to make this point at the beginning, there is a book, and it's published by Progressive Press of California. And if you go to the Progressive Press website, you have to look a little bit hard to find it. I hope to have on my website here, tarpley.net, I hope by the end of the evening tonight, maybe not quite yet, I don't think it's up there now, but it'll go up very soon.
Okay.
And it's a link, right? So you can just click on the cover. Now, this is kind of an elite book. I guess there's no way around it because it's got more than half of it is in French. And let me just explain what this is. It is a book called La France Conquise, Edward VII and Clemenceau. Clemenceau being the French Prime Minister. So France conquered, and the idea of this is that France has been conquered by the British, and in particular by Edward VII, King Edward VII in person, essentially dominates French politics. So this is a book from 1909, I believe, and it's written by a former foreign minister of France. And this was something that I found in the Library of Congress, 1906, Garnier, famous publishing house. So it's Paris, 1906. This was something that I found in the Library of Congress here in Washington at, it must have been about 1995.
Well, and, back when you had time to browse, all right.
Well, no, it was, this was already, this was for a conference at the time.
I see.
But so we have that. It's a book. It's a short book. In French, though, unfortunately, or whatever. And then there's also a short pamphlet from a German author who is close to the German General Staff, and this is from 1916, I think. This is from 1914, from the beginning of the war.
Right.
And the thesis of this little pamphlet, this is quite short, that Edward VII is the greatest, he's committed the greatest crimes against humanity of anybody in the 20th century up to then. In other words, from the point of view of 1914. And the thesis is that he is the mastermind of a strategy of encirclement. That is to say, of hemming Germany in between the French in the west and Russian Empire in the east, and that alliance, of course, subservient to the interests of Great Britain. And that's the Triple Entente, right? The Triple Entente that went to war in 1914. Great Britain, the dominating force, the French and the Russians, unfortunately, continental stooges, destined to take the beating that I just referred to. Right? 9 million casualties for Russia.
Quite
6
a meat
million
grinder.
Casualties for France.
Yeah. All right. Stand by just a second. We'll come right back with Webster in just 2 minutes. Okay, and we're back with Webster, Griffin, Tarpley, talking about World War I. Now, all of you listening in on our European outlet, the Hotbird satellite over there, 120 million potential homes. Those of you who are with us tonight or who listen in the future certainly have a much different understanding, a grasp, a feel of the horrors of World War I than any American does, or most any American. Well, people over here, frankly, just don't really even know it much more than a title, a name, World War I. That's all the average American understands. Resulting, of course, in the Treaty of Versailles, and that led directly to World War II, not very long thereafter. Go ahead, Webster, please.
Well, yes, though I think there's a significant understanding, maybe from the U.S. point of view, it's easier to get to the actual causes, right? Because as you see, even the scholars of these European countries, you think after 20 or 30 years of the European Union, they'd have a more...
You'd think.
More of an overview, right? But instead, it's exactly the same chauvinistic, narrow-minded stuff, which was how the whole thing was created. Now, I want to recommend this book, right? Please go to Progressive Press, or go to Tarpley.net, and for that elite, right, that can read French and English, there's in here we have my essay on Edward VII, the Triple Entente, and World War I. I would sum it up in the following way: the person who did most to create World War I, the person who consciously wanted it, tried to bring it about, and very largely succeeded, is King Edward VII of Great Britain. And a lot of this was the work of decades. It started during those long, long decades when he was the Prince of Wales, because he's the son of Queen Victoria, and she lived to a very advanced age, right? Up till, 1902, 1903.
What was his big axe to grind?
His axe to grind was the typical British geopolitics, and that is to say, identify the strongest continental power and then ally with the second strongest against the strongest and try to use the second strongest as a land power, so-called continental dagger,
right,
against the strongest. And the thing with the debate in Britain in the 1860s, 1870s, it's the same period that I just looked at from the point of view of how the British really wanted to attack Lincoln and the Union and destroy the United States and perpetuate the Confederacy and set up a huge slave empire in the Caribbean and Latin America and perhaps even beyond. But remember, the deep antagonism of the 19th century, from the Congress of Vienna, right, from the fall of Napoleon, 1815, until about 1907, and this is all done by Edward, is that if the British are on one side, Russia is on the other. In other words, these are the two main enemies in the world, Britain and Russia. And since the British embodied so much of the evils of imperialism, it meant that the Russian, there were positive features in Russia that were brought out. These have been systematically falsified in the U.S.
prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. We got to remember that too. All right.
Yeah, well, and again, Fleuron will say that the 1905 revolution, which he lived to see, was a destabilization carried out by networks unleashed by Edward VII. In other words, the mother of every Russian revolutionary was London. And that was true through the 19th century, right?
Yeah.
The famous saying, Britain supports all revolutions except her own. In other words, revolution anywhere, but not in Britain, right? Then it's different. So here's the idea, though. Edward VII assembled, through personal diplomacy, this infernal machine of alliances, especially this Triple Entente. He starts with, at a certain point, he finds that there's an alliance between France and Russia. We actually have to account for why that should be so, because it's not obvious. But he takes that over, and he uses that as a kind of a nutcracker. So the idea is encirclement, and he doesn't stop with that, right? He's got operations going in Austria, in Spain, in Scandinavia, in Italy. He's working everywhere because he has the cunning to see that Germany is the strongest continental power and that Russia no longer is.
Well, it's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? I mean, my God.
Well, in 1860, 1870, maybe it wasn't. In other words, that all happened rather fast.
Right.
And, the unification of Germany creates this power. Then it takes a couple of decades for the industrial potential and trade and so forth to become obvious. But He's out in front. He's already anti-German, anti-Prussian in the 1860s, right? In 1866 or 1870. And he's deterred, as we've learned, by Tsar Alexander II of Russia. But here's the big thing is this. Edward VII creates this infernal device of these alliances so that any war that breaks out involving France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary especially, and maybe even some more, any war that breaks out among them turns into a world war. Any war becomes a world war because of this question of the mobilization army, that you, in order to put an army in the field, the army is now so big that you can't keep it as a standing army. You've got to send out these notices. You've got to mobilize your entire railway system for a week or 10 days to get all the soldiers, to their units at the front, and then have them march off, and then the logistics has to kick in, and so forth. So these are mobilization armies, and one of the maxims of the period is that mobilization is war, and this is especially true for Russia, because Russia is this country that takes a long time to mobilize, right? Weeks, maybe a month, 2 months, right? Long time. But once they're mobilized, they have these huge armies. And the problem for Germany is that if Russia mobilizes, they don't have to shoot across their border. They don't have to take a step across their border. That's a deadly threat to you, because once Russia is fully mobilized, they're just tremendously formidable. So I would say on the side of the sins of commission, right, evil intent, criminal intent, it's Edward VII of Britain. Absolutely.
A man virtually unknown today. Nobody's...
Well, no, there are cigars named after him.
I got you, but you talk to the average American, and they don't know Edward VII from...
Probably not. The Edwardian period, right?
Yeah, sure.
People, Edwardian elegance. Well,
I'm there.
He, of course... The other thing about him...
Let's followed Victorian England, and so it had its own identity.
Yeah, well, and that's his mother, right? So, and he's got the famous quote is he says, "When I go to church, they tell me about an eternal father, but it looks like I'm saddled with an eternal mother. He can't wait for her to die so that he can take over." Now, not by coincidence, and I hope in tribute to my influence on the topic, which has been going on now for almost 20 years. I've been putting out this.
Yeah.
There is a book. We got a new biography. Let me see if I can find the references. But there is a new biography of Edward VII, and what this does, I just want to warn people, without going through the details of this book, that the way the establishment historians get around the question of Edward VII is they say, "Oh, well, he was a playboy, he was a rake, he was a party animal." And he was only chasing women and drunk all the time.
Trivializing a very evil presence here.
Yeah. All right. So, but this is what you're going to find, and this is this new. Maybe I can find it during one of the breaks. But there's a new biography which goes along these lines.
Yeah, we got one coming up here. So go ahead. 30 seconds.
Okay. So he's the one with the sins of commission. He's the one who actually brings this about. Of course, he's dead before it starts. So that raises the question: how can he start the war if he's already dead? He did this by being the patron of the network of all the people who actually did start the war, starting with Sir Edward Grey of Great Britain, Théophile Delcassé of France, Poincaré, Clemenceau, Izvolsky of Russia, on and on and on. These are all protégés of Edward VII. Sir Winston Churchill is a protégé of Edward VII.
Yeah. All right. Stand by. We'll do our bottom of the hour break. Come right back with Webster in just a couple of minutes. Glad you're along this evening. Okay, let's get right back to Webster. Fascinating history. We're supposed to learn from history. We don't, unfortunately, but it's nonetheless very important to be, at least in a cursory sense, familiar with it, and we're getting there right now. Go ahead.
So, again, Edward VII, King Edward VII, Emperor of India, great political operative of the House of Windsor or Hanover or Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, as it was called then. He's, out of all the numerous, statesmen, heads of state, he does this largely as a matter of personal diplomacy. In other words, he's got all this time on his hands, right, from about 18 1860 or 1870 until about 1900. He's got 30 to 40 years of scheming, networking, spends a lot of time in Paris. He's the leader of Freemasons. He sets up Freemasonic lodges. I think you can make a pretty good case that the Sarajevo assassination was ordered, certainly known in advance.
Well, it was no coincidence. Wasn't a random act. Agreed.
It's a British Freemasonic network. And Edward was the head of this thing called the Quatuor Coronati Lodge, the Four Crowned Heads Lodge in London. So he was the Grand Master of the British Scottish Rite Freemasonry. By the way, this disinformation line, this is from the Washington Post book review, Sunday, January 5th, right, a couple of days ago. The Heir Apparent, A Life of Edward VII, the Playboy Prince, by Jane Ridley, Random House. Okay, so he's a randy prince, and we go through all the mistresses. One of them is the mother of Sir Winston Churchill, Jenny Jerome. And you can make an argument that Sir Winston Churchill was the bastard son of King Edward VII. Wouldn't that be interesting? But certainly, he's got a network, right? And that is one of his tremendous strengths. And the other thing that he's got is, as the eldest son of Queen Victoria, he then becomes the uncle. Well, let me put it another way. Queen Victoria's sons and daughters intermarried with all the royal houses of Europe. And that meant that, for example, if one of Queen Victoria's daughters married the King of Prussia, which is what happened, that when Kaiser Wilhelm, right, the Emperor William II, the demonized one of World War I, when he was growing up, his uncle was King Edward VII. And that extended to other powers, including the Tsar of Russia. He was called the Uncle of Europe. That's King Edward VII. But, of course, he's the satanic, homicidal uncle of Europe. So this is where the impetus comes from. He saw, again, as early as 1866, that Germany was going to become the main continental power. Therefore, Britain would have to reorganize the entire diplomatic and military effort against Germany. But then something else happened in 1899, 1900. It's the Boer War in South Africa. And this is
brutal, genocidal butchery.
Yeah, right, by the
horrible,
British, right?
Horrible.
Kicking off the century. And here's the thing, though. This is what I would call a League of Cambrai moment. This is drawn from Venetian history. In other words, the Venetian Republic in 1509, had been, for decades and centuries, playing geopolitics against everybody. They'd been betraying them. They'd be playing one against the other. They'd been tricking them and duping them and whatnot. At a certain point, they all so enraged that they all lined up against Venice. So 1509, Europe, everybody, France, Holy Roman Empire, Germany, Spain, you name it, Italian states, papacy, everybody. They're all against the Venetian Republic. And this is similar to what happened in the Boer War. Everybody in Europe, starting with Russia, Germany, France, everybody hate the British. And there was a very concrete possibility of this continental bloc emerging, a continental alliance, in particular France, Germany, and Russia, against the British, to kick them out of Europe, right, to pacify Europe, to end the arms race, to avoid World War I. And the person who was unable to understand this, or the person thanks to whom this failed, is this Emperor William II of Germany. So that we got to talk about him for a minute. Because if Edward VII is the Machiavellian schemer, right, this evil demiurge who's planning this historical catastrophe, his idea was Edward VII thought that if he could get World War I, that the British Empire could last for another 100 years, right? That he would be guaranteeing them another 100 years of world supremacy. And then, of course, it didn't work that way, but that was his idea. At the other side, though, we have the Emperor William II, right? Kaiser Wilhelm, and the story with him is its ineptitude it's a pathetic, bungling. It is a psychological weakness, fecklessness, recklessness, to be sure, but not in any way that I've ever been able to find a coherent design for world power or anything of the sort. It's simply, posturing, the typical things that a weakling will do. And one of the reasons he was a weakling, as this French author Fleuron, right, the former foreign minister, writes, Edward VII was a master of psychological profiling, and this was his hobby, his stock in trade. And he had accurately profiled the neurosis or psychosis of the Emperor William II, and he knew how to play on this with a consummate precision. And he could make him explode in rage or whimper in wretched grief or whatever it was, just about any given moment. He could play him like a violin, and that is why you'd have to say there was if the Emperor William II had taken some very elementary countermeasures, he could have avoided World War I. He could have made the outbreak of World War I impossible. But because of his arrogance and stupidity and fecklessness, he wouldn't do this. I'll just give you one example. When the Emperor William II took over the German Empire, it's about 1890. So his father, who had united the country, and others had died. So he wants to assert himself that he's the boss. Mm-hmm. Well, there's Chancellor Bismarck left over. What are you going to do about him? He's still there, right? Elder statesman.
Yeah, let's keep going through the break, Webster.
Fire him.
Yeah.
So fire him, and then the most fateful thing. The heart of Bismarck's policy was what was known in those days as the Three Emperors, right? The Three Emperors League. Prussia, or Germany by now, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. So those three, right? The British are against them, right? The British say, oh, those are the arbitrary powers, those are the reactionaries and everything. But Bismarck knew, in particular, that he needed to always be on good terms with Russia. And he made sure, generally speaking, that this was the case. Bismarck knew, everybody knew, that you could not have a general European war if Russia did not participate. And as long as Russia and Germany were more or less on friendly terms, there was not going to be a general European war. So along comes William II, and he says, I don't care about that anymore. We're so strong. We don't need allies. We don't need friends. I'm not going to lift a finger to keep Russia on our side. There was something called the Reinsurance Treaty. This was Bismarck's diplomacy with Russia. And it simply said, whatever else happens in the world, there won't be a war between Germany and Russia. No war. Non-aggression pact, right? Guaranteed. Whatever any other alliance or agreement might entail. And sure enough, the Emperor William II says, dump that. I don't care about that. Get rid of it. And immediately, what emerges within a couple of years is what's known as the dual alliance. This France and Russia united to encircle Germany. Now, this is not the end of the world yet, although we're getting there, because that is, I think, in some ways a defensive alliance. The moment where it becomes offensive is in 1903, when Edward VII pulls out his Freemasonic groups in Paris and says, let's have the British-French Entente Cordiale of 1903, and then a couple of years later when he pulls out his Russian Freemasons, and we have the British-Russian Entente of 1907-1908. So there you've got it. Now it's an offensive alliance spearheaded by the British against France, using France and using Russia against Germany. And again, Edward does that all by himself. The British Foreign Office does not take the leading role in this. It is the personal diplomacy of Edward VII. And I've got in this essay, in this collection that you can get at Progressive Press via Tarpley.net, we have the Belgian ambassador, say a Belgian ambassador in London. He says, look, we have two foreign policies here. There's one which is just bureaucratic. That's the Foreign Office. Nobody cares about that.
Right.
The real foreign policy is the personal and dynastic policy of King Edward VII. So
interesting word.
What it leads
dynastic.
to is that the Kaiser Wilhelm, who is supposed to be this demon of geopolitical cunning and scheming, is a patsy. He's pathetic.
Correct.
His weakness is just overwhelming, and nobody trusts him. That's the other thing. When we have powerful groups in Russia and in France who say, "Look, it's the Boer War. The British are running wild. Everybody hates them. Let's take this opportunity to kick them out of Europe or maybe crush them completely." The person who says no is William II, the Emperor of Germany. He has this love-hate relation because of his mother. He has an English mother, and of course that's his mother. That's the only mother he ever had. But he also hates her.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got a physical deformity, another big problem. He's got a withered arm. One of his arms is atrophied. So he can't ride a horse. He can't, do the things that a Prussian officer and militarist should be able to do.
No heroics.
This is pretty much the constellation. So you can say, in general, it is the titled feudal aristocrats, right? The feudal nobility, who the world that they still dominate in most of these countries. France is the only partial exception, right? France is a republic, but there are still plenty of nobility running around, right? And French nobility, very strong and always revolting, as we say. But in these other countries, right? These are feudal oligarchs, right? Emperors, counts, dukes, and everything else. In Germany, the main field armies are run by the kings of the component states, like the King of Bavaria, or the King of Baden-Württemberg gets to run the army, or the Prince of one of these places.
Right.
So this is the world that they create. But the actual person who embodies this is this evil criminal energy guy, Edward VII of Britain, and then on the other side, this pathetic, incapable, highly suggestible fool, the German emperor, right, William II. There's also this moment, right, where the German emperor William and the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, they realize that they're headed towards something very bad, and it's actually funny. This is about 1905, 1906. If you want to make the argument that Germany was looking for world domination and wanted a war, well then, the time to start that war was 1905, right? Because Russia was in chaos, right? Russia had just been defeated by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. This was also set up by Edward VII. You have to remember the immediate prelude to the Russo-Japanese War is the British-Japanese alliance of the first years of the last century, right? And that was done. That was Edward VII's way to break out of the isolation of the Boer War. He turned to somebody who didn't really care much about, the Boer War. That was Japan. So they made an alliance. And the goal of that was to stop Russia from expanding in the Far East and instead drive the Russians back into Europe, where they would be sure to collide with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and so it was. Mm-hmm. But in 1905, if you were Germany and you wanted to start a war and win it, 1905, because Russia was crippled, right? They couldn't do anything. Their fleet had been destroyed. Their armies were in chaos. Half of them were out there in the Far East, right? They were just, they could not have launched anything serious into Europe. But instead of starting a war, this foolish Emperor William II tries to go to the Tsar, and this is the famous Björkö meeting in Finland on yachts. He says, let's us, Germany and Russia, make a little agreement that, let's try to go back to the reinsurance policy, basically, right? Let's be friends again, and let's not let ourselves be played one against the other. And the Tsar actually signs it. He says, fine, I'll do it. Except that by this time, Edward, the German emperor, William II, is so discredited, he is considered such a liar and a fool and so incapable of delivering Germany. Right? He can't really make good on these commitments. That the German foreign policy bureaucracy rebels. The foreign minister threatens to quit. At that point, the Emperor of Germany, William II, says, well, if my foreign minister is going to quit, I would have to commit suicide. This raises questions about the nature of their relationship, but there it is. So this wonderful last chance or pathetic last hope of getting out of this infernal machine, this ends after about 1908, 1909. And then it's just a question of when the event will actually occur. King Edward died from, being a rake in 1910, and then after that it's his stable of protégés, right, who actually carry this stuff out. Let me just point to Sir Edward Grey, right, the British foreign minister. Here's the trick with Sir Edward Grey. He has seen in the past, 10, 15 years, that when you get a big crisis and it looks like an actual all-European war might break out, at that point Germany will back down. So here's what he does. When you have the Sarajevo assassination, again, I think the British have a big role in this, and there are a couple of books about this which I could mention. But when the Germans see that a war is actually possible, they look at Britain and they want to see what the British attitude is. So Sir Edward Grey to Germany says, well, we can't have a war about this. Britain will try to mediate this, right? We're going to try to make sure that this doesn't get out of hand. So that's his deception operation towards Germany. He makes them think that Britain is going to stay out of it if worse comes to worse. Vis-a-vis the French and the Russians, Edward Grey does just the opposite. He essentially says to them, look, we've got to stop these Germans now. We'll be on your side. Don't hesitate. Go to the mat. Mobilize, whatever it takes. We'll be with you. So that duplicity, it convinces the French and the Russians to exaggerate, right, to go wild. And the Germans essentially say, well, at this point, we can let the Austrians do whatever they want. Vienna is looking for revenge against Serbia for these assassinations, because the assassinations were blamed on Serbia. So we'll let Austria-Hungary run wild. If you wanted to do the map of the capitals on the eve of the war, you'd have to say in Vienna, right, Austria, there were madmen who wanted a regional war. In other words, they wanted to attack Serbia because Serbia was making their lives very difficult, right, from an imperialist point of view.
Right.
In Russia, there were Slavophiles who wanted a general European war, but they really had no way of bringing that about themselves. In Germany, you had this William II, who is simply he has no policy. In other words, his policy is simply bombastic fecklessness one day, weeping and cringing the next day, and so forth, right? But in Britain, here you have geopolitical game masters who want a general European war, and they actually have the ability to bring it about, right, as I just went through with Sir Edward Grey. They can encourage the French and the Russians to overdo it, be very aggressive, and they can also make the Germans think that there's no real danger. And that's the combination that leads to the war. Now, if you just want to briefly ask yourself, what do we learn out of this for now? Well, there's a lot. But the main thing is, for the British and the French, the lesson is imperialism is suicide. It is not a rational policy for a modern state. In other words, if you want to play imperialism, Libya, Syria, eventually you'll have a bloodbath, and it'll be at your expense.
Well, they did in South Africa, and you mentioned it earlier. Over 100,000 people died. It said that 25 to 30,000 Boer women and children. These are Christian women and children died.
Yeah,
in
this
the camps.
was the thing, of course, with the British. The British were saying, "Oh, the Anglo-Saxon master race and all that." Yeah, but wait a minute. What's with this?
No, they're killing their own.
These are these Dutch, right? They're Germanic. How can you do this?
That's right.
So
and by the way, listen to this, folks. 1901, when the Boer War essentially ended, 238,000 ounces of gold were mined from one particular area. Now, this is what it was all about. Within 4 years, by 1905, not 238,000 ounces, 4,706,000 ounces of gold were mined. It was all about gold. It's a typical spoils of war.
And
natural resources.
Other, geopolitics, right?
Yeah.
It's a choke point, right? The whole world merchant marine traffic has to go around that, at least a lot of
Exactly, yeah. 2 minutes left, Webster. Go ahead.
But then, so that was, where were we now?
I heard the word feckless in there again.
Yeah, feckless. That's crazy Emperor William II of...
Yeah.
All right, so the British were completely isolated in 1900, and by the time Edward dies in 1910, they've got cannon fodder, France, Russia, and he's laid the groundwork for detaching Italy from the Central Powers. So instead of going to war with three great powers, 3 against 3, right? On the one side, Britain, France, Russia, against Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy. Italy changes, so it becomes 4 against 2. And there's even an attempt, one of the last things Edward VII does is to try to convince the Austrian Emperor, Franz Joseph, that he too should join the British side. And the British have this insurance policy with the Japanese in the Far East. Just one other thing is the duping of Theodore Roosevelt, right? Theodore Roosevelt, obviously one of the worst presidents, right? One of the most racist, imperialist, vicious characters. In the case of Theodore Roosevelt, Edward VII plays the Anglo-Saxon race card. And he writes him these letters, and he says, we are the 2 representatives of the Anglo-Saxon race. I, Edward VII, represent the monarchical branch of the Anglo-Saxons, and you, dear Theodore Roosevelt, represent the wonderful democratic branch, but we are going to work together. And there's an entire correspondence along these lines. And remember, the British ambassador, Cecil Spring Rice, has written this interesting profile of Theodore Roosevelt, which was undoubtedly something that Edward, either knew himself or would have been interested in. That the mentality of Theodore Roosevelt was that he had the mental age of a 6-year-old boy, and that for him, life was to walk along a beach with many pretty rocks and pretty shells, and you couldn't stay interested in any one of them. So you'd go picking them up. Just Google that, right? Cecil Spring Rice, Theodore Roosevelt, and the mental age or the mentality of a 6-year-old boy. So what it comes down to is, unfortunately, if you want to put the cause anywhere, it's the British. Although you could also say to the Germans, how come you didn't figure this out? And this is actually where I wanted to go. The lesson for the British and the French is stop your imperialism. Right? Don't think that you can relaunch imperialism in the Middle East today. Right? The U.S. is receding to some extent. That's fine. Demilitarized. It looks like a. Well,
the latest is that the U.S. is using financed Al Qaeda to try to represent its interests to subdue
these are all desperate
the Middle East.
Expedients. But
exactly.
the problem for the British and the French is they imagine that there's a void there that they can fill. They're crazy. The other side of it, though, is Germany. Right? The arrogance, the overwhelming, bombastic, rude. Behavior that elicits so much ill will. You look at Merkel today, right? She wants to dictate killer austerity to much of Europe.
We got to wrap it up.
You go back to the 1890s, and you look at these people, the people that the Emperor William II put in the German Foreign Office. There's this one guy, von Holstein, right? And Holstein, like a cow, right?
Yeah.
Holstein cow.
Yeah.
So von Holstein is he's the Eminence Grise, the gray eminence of the German Foreign Office. And his line is essentially, we don't need an alliance with Russia. We don't want an alliance with Russia. We don't want an alliance with anybody because we are the greatest power in the world, and we'll roll over everybody. And, of course, this is absolutely fatuous. And it is.
Historically, certainly personally, it's ridiculous. We could spend a whole program. We really should take a program and look at what the British did to India. I think that would be very interesting.
Sure,
the
but
ultimate
again,
imperialist
here is
conquest.
Here we want to do what the British did to Europe, and
well,
I think
you did it.
Is
9 million dead.
And of course, there's more. We really ought to go through some of this stuff because some of it's very interesting. Like we'd have to include the assassination of Rasputin. How about this? Sarah Bernhardt. You know her, the actress.
Sure.
Another girlfriend of Edward VII, and he said to her one night, "Oh, Sarah, I've always wanted to be an actor. Can you help me get on the stage?" So, I think the play is called Fedora. There's an opera of the same name.
Correct.
And in this case, there's a dead body has to be on the stage. So, when the curtain opens, the dead body is there, and few in the audience recognize that was Edward VII at that time, the Prince of Wales, right?
Funny.
Or Wales, as he was known to the dancing girls at the Folies Bergère of Paris.
We got to wrap
So you get the idea. Oh, and then the other one, just one last thing.
All right.
Jack the Ripper is most likely the son of King Edward VII. Prince Albert Victor Edward. Jack the Ripper, most likely the son of King Edward VII.
Just slightly twisted. All right.
Take a look at that book. Try Tarpley.net. We'll have a link up there. La France Conquise and my essay and this German pamphlet and some other material is there.
Very good. Thank you, Webster.
Okay.
Nice start. We'll talk to you next month. Be well. Take care.
Okay.
And
bye-bye.
fasten your seatbelts. All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night.